Welcome back to Rugby from the Stands. First things first, I owe you guys an apology. I didn't get the Sharks video out last week. That's because I'm flying out to the motherland next week for the first test, which I'm obviously very, very excited about. But I've also been trying to tie up a few loose ends at work and at home and other travel stuff. So I didn't want to rush out a Sharks reaction just for the sake of getting a video out. But I've got you. Instead of doing 3 separate match reviews, I thought it would actually be more interesting to step back and look at the whole thing. Because, look, we all watched those games. We had a pretty good idea of how New Zealand should go against the 3 URC sides. I feel like the more useful question for me is, what did the All Blacks actually show across those 3 games? Did they start doing anything differently? Did anything from the July test carry into the South African tour? And is there anything in these numbers that should potentially make us worried or excited before the Springbok test? So I've put the 6 games side by side, the 3 tests in July, then the Stormers, Sharks, and Bulls games in South Africa. Now, obviously, this is not apples to apples. Test rugby and franchise rugby are totally different things. There were different opposition every week. There were different combinations that were trialed out as well. So, but I still think that there's a few really interesting clues that we can glean from both those sets of data because the scores in South Africa were obviously big, 38, 54, and 50. But I was more interested in whether they were just getting easier opposition or whether New Zealand were actually doing something differently or they were trialing out something differently with the ball. And there's also a couple of things here and there that I genuinely think that are worth looking at before the Springboks test. So let me start off with getting our slides up and running. So let's start here because this is probably where our analysis should start. Look at the total rucks. In the 3 tests, New Zealand were forming 120, 146, and 142 rucks. Then in South Africa, on tour, it drops to 93, 85, and 91. Now, fewer rucks on their own don't automatically mean either better rugby or worse rugby. You could have fewer rucks because you're kicking away the ball or you're getting turned over or whatever it is. But when you put it alongside the middle chart, rucks per carry, it starts to look like something. It goes down in every single game. 0.83 against France, 0.78 against Italy, 0.71 against Ireland, then 0.66, 0.58, and 0.58 in South Africa. So New Zealand are clearly getting through more carries without having to set another ruck. That can be line breaks, it can be offloads, it can be the carrier getting through contact and finding someone late. And then you look at the offloads on the right. That's the big clue for me. They go from 5.5 per 100 carries against France to 16.6 against the Bulls. So I don't think they started in South Africa, but you can clearly see that the South African games just took it further. And the key thing to remember is that rucks, at least I look at rucks as a proxy for phases. So we're looking at July series having relatively more phase play, but in South Africa, there seems to be a clear want to keep the ball alive. They're not going down or creating or forming rucks, but they clearly want to keep the ball alive. And that kind of culminated in the Bulls game where you see the highest number of offloads per 100 carries, right? That's quite interesting. On that point on offloads per carries, right? The offload rate across the July test was 7.9 per 100 carries. Across the South African tour, it goes up to 13.5. So that's a big jump. And you can see it game by game. 11.3 against the Stormers, 12.3 against the Sharks, then 16.6 against the Bulls. That Bulls number is huge. And if you watch that game, you could feel it. New Zealand were not just taking contact, falling over, setting the ruck and doing it again. They were keeping the ball alive. They were finding little bits of space after contact. The support runners were there. The good part is that points per 22 entry stayed high. Line breaks per 100 carries went up as well. But to be fair, there is a bit of a cost. Turnovers lost per 100 carries go from 6.6 across the test to 9.7 on tour. So I can't tell you from this data set which turnover came directly from an offload or what the cause of that turnover was. So I'm not going to say that the charts actually prove that offloads are causing the turnovers. What it does tell us is that New Zealand are taking more chances with the ball. they're getting more out of it. They're also losing it more often. And honestly, that is probably the trade-off when they have decided to play with trying to keep the ball alive. The other thing to bear in mind as well is that these 3 games are kind of like selection games, right? So they're trials for selections for the tests. So you obviously have a situation where lots of players might try a little bit harder, might try to throw that offload when it probably wasn't the right decision. And so an increased turnover rate is expected in these 3 games. So I wouldn't really worry too much about it. And also the trend looks pretty decent. They went from 10.6 down to 8.9 by the time that they played the Bulls. So I'm not really too worried about it come the test series. Now, I also wanted to check the work rate as well, because you can watch those South African games and think, man, these guys are working their absolute butts off. But when you look at carries plus tackles per 80 minutes for the players who played enough minutes in both blocks, most of them actually went down. 15 of the 19 players here had fewer involvements per 80 on tour. Now, I understand some players didn't get game time, like a full match, or maybe more than a game, and that's why I've normalized it to a full 80 minutes. But the work rate average drop is 5.4. So that doesn't mean that the players' output was less. Obviously not. It means that the game had fewer contact events. There were fewer rucks, which means that there were more broken moments. So there were more offloads. So look at Wallace Satiti, for example, here. He goes from 31 involvements per 80 minutes in the July series to just 16.6. That's not because he suddenly forgot how to work. The game around him gave him fewer of those carry, tackle sequences, right? Because we're just looking at carries and tackles. So I think that they're playing a game that gives them more moments to hurt teams with fewer contact events in between, which I thought was quite cool. Now, the breakdown. There's some good stuff here. New Zealand are winning more turnovers from opposition ball. Across the tests, it was 4.1 turnovers won per 100 opposition rucks. On tour, this number goes up to 7.1. Against the Sharks and Bulls, it is 8.9 and 8.3. So they're definitely finding more ways to get on the ball defensively. That could be jackal pressure, tackle pressure, forcing errors. So again, this data set doesn't give us exactly why those turnovers happen, but clearly you can see that the output is there. The concern is the next chart. They're losing their own ball more often too. That's what we talked about just now. And again, the raw rate per ruck looks especially bad because they're forming fewer rucks. Per 100 carries, it still rises from 6.6 to 9.7. Then on the far right, their own fast ruck percentage drops from 71% in the tests to 64% on tour. Now, again, the breakdown picture is not that New Zealand are smashing everyone at the ruck. It's more messy than that. They're creating more chaos. They're winning more ball in that chaos. But they're giving up more ball too. And their own ruck speed is not getting quicker. Now, obviously, when they went to South Africa, all of us knew that they would not be able to play with that same ruck speed that they had, similar to the game against France, right? That 86% lightning quick ball rate is not going to happen in South Africa, right? So 66%, I reckon, is actually not too bad. Anything over 60% in South Africa is not too bad. Now, you've got to put a dampener of about a 10-point percentage dampener, because when you play against the Springboks, you can bet your bottom dollar that they will slow our ruck speed. And that's what they've done to us over a number of years. In every game that we've played against them, the stats basically say that they slow us down in pretty much every single time we play them. So if we are putting 60% and above against the URC teams, expect that number to be even 10 points less than that come test time. Now, discipline is a funny one because the tour average doesn't look too great. It is 10.7 penalties conceded per game compared with 8.3 across the 3 tests. But when you look at the actual games, you can see what happened. The Stormers match was an absolute shocker. 16 penalties and 3 cards. That's the game doing most of the damage from an average perspective here. Then they bring it back to 8 penalties against the Sharks and 8 against the Bulls. No cards in either of those games. So I'm not ready to say that the discipline is fixed. We only have 2 games after that first game, but I also wouldn't look at the tour average and panic. It was one really poor discipline night, plus the team were getting used to a new style of refereeing. So it looks like the team have adapted and fixed that problem. So hopefully come test time, that Stormers type game absolutely will not happen. You give South Africa that many penalties and 3 cards, you're good as done, basically. Now, let's look at set piece. Set piece is actually quite encouraging in one area. Obviously, that game against the Stormers kind of unearthed some weaknesses and gaps. But as the games progressed, and even the game against Bulls, we saw that our scrums seem to be pretty solid. Is it going to be solid enough against the Springboks? Again, time will tell, but they're trending in the right direction. The lineout numbers on tour are obviously better. We've got 100% against the Stormers, 83% against the Sharks, which wasn't too great, but we're back up to over 90% or 92 to be precise against the Bulls. So that's better than the July test series the July 3 games that we played. And the scrum retention is also pretty steady as well. It's not showing massive issues from our own feed. But when it comes to the games against the Springboks, can we hold up? I reckon we could, but it's going to be a challenge, obviously. But let's see. The other thing that I am a little bit worried about is restarts. The All Blacks retained 71% against Ireland, 83% against the Stormers, and 75% against the Bulls. So in half of these 6 games, they're under 85% on their own restarts received. Now, when you're playing against the Springboks, this is exactly the sort of thing that they will target us. You kick either deep or short. And in this case, I've noticed that we tend to struggle whenever they kick short. The Springboks will probably chase really hard. They make every restart uncomfortable for us. And suddenly, the All Blacks are starting to attack from a bad picture, right? Or the quality of the ball that they get to attack with is not going to be high. So the line out looks better. The scrum looks okay for now. But I would still have a little concern around restart security as well. Kicking is another one where I don't want to pretend that I have high quality data here. All that I have is that we can see how often that each team kicked. So we can't see whether the exit was successful, whether the kick was contestable, whether they regathered, whether the kick chase put the other side under pressure. So this is not a kicking quality board. All that I have is that New Zealand kicked more per 100 rucks on tour versus the July test. The Sharks game is the big outlier at 40, and that came off a low ruck count game. So don't get too carried away with that one. But the bigger point is this: they kicked more on the tour. And if you're looking at the territory side of this chart, the territory didn't jump with it. So clearly they're not kicking for territory. The kicking purpose is mainly as an attacking option, right? Or those are clearing kicks. So the block average actually goes from 50% territory in July to 47% across those 3 games on tour. That doesn't mean that the kicking was bad, okay? It just means that the kick volume by itself tells us very little, unfortunately. So if we had exit success and kick return data, I would go much deeper on this. Unfortunately, with this data set that I have access to on Rugby Pass, all I can say is that the boot was certainly used a lot more in South Africa than during the July Nations Championship series. Now, I think this is important because it stops us getting too excited about the score lines. The first number is dominant tackles per 100 tackles. That drops from 5.3, which is relatively still low in July, to 3.7 on tour. So whatever the defense did well in South Africa, it wasn't built around constantly winning massive dominant collisions. To be fair, maybe it's the All Blacks trying to preserve themselves, not get injured, and trying to not really impose themselves physically during these warm-up games. At least these games are considered as warm-up games or selection trials for the squad. So I think they will focus more on attack, I suppose, than on the dominance during tackle time, which I kind of totally understand. The second one, as we talked about, is ruck speed. We've already touched on it, but it drops from 71% to 64%. So if we put the whole thing in one page, this is the change. Offloads made per 100 carries are up 72%. Line breaks per 100 carries are up 32%. Turnovers 1 per 100 opposition rucks are up 73%. So those are proper changes. They're not tiny. Points per 22 entry are up as well, although only slightly. So they're still finishing chances at a decent rate. But the warning signs are also here. Turnovers lost per 100 carries are up 47%. Penalties conceded per game are up 28%, even if the Stormers game is obviously skewing the data. But the way I read it is not that New Zealand have become a completely different test side in these 3 franchise games. I think they've become more willing to play a game that is a lot messier, and they're more willing to keep the ball alive. And I think that's the more important thing. They're wanting to keep the ball alive, tire the South African teams, and they're more willing to take the chance after contact. And against these teams, it clearly has worked really, really well. All right, so where do I land on all of this? Firstly, I do think that there is a real attacking shift here. The offloads are up, the ruck per carry are down, the line breaks are up. Secondly, there's a little bit of a price to it as well. They're losing more ball. The restarts are giving me a cause for concern, and I'm not 100% confident about our scrums either. Hopefully we can get parity at scrum time, and also our discipline and our high ball catching. I really hope that in the Bulls game we were getting peppered with high balls, but unfortunately the Bulls decided not to kick us contestables. It would have been great for the team to actually get a bit of high ball kicking practice during game scenario, but I wonder if Rassi had told the Bulls coaching team not to play that style of game. And thirdly, and this is the big one, the Springboks are a 5-fold, 10-fold level above, right? So the question now is whether the All Blacks can still do what they did in these past 3 games, and especially in a much more slower, more physical, more contested, and a far less forgiving Springbok team, because that is exactly what the Springboks are going to ask them. So let me know what you think. Do you see this as a genuine change in how the All Blacks are trying to play? Or do you think that the franchise games have made the numbers look way better than they really are? Also, guys, I need a little bit of a favor from my South African viewers in the comments, especially those of you living in Johannesburg. I'm embarrassingly underprepared for this trip. So I have a few silly questions. Question number 1 is, do I need to carry cash around? Because I rarely carry any cash with me right now. I usually use my Apple Pay wherever I go. So can I get away with Apple Pay in most places in South Africa? And the big one is, I do have an early morning flight to Durban from Johannesburg. And from everything that I read, the Gautrain, sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. The metro basically is the best way to get to the airport. Apparently it's like 15 minutes to get to the airport. So the question is that I'm worried about is whether I need to use cash, whether I need to buy a ticket, or can I just tap using my Apple Pay wallet? Or do I need to have a physical credit card, or do I need to buy a contactless card at the station? Because that obviously adds additional minutes in the morning trying to queue up for that. So I've tried researching about it, and I still don't have any information on the Gautrain. So if you can help me out before I arrive looking completely lost at the station, that'll be very, very helpful. As always, please like and subscribe. I'd love your help to get to 10,000 subs before the first test of the Greatest Rivalry Tour. So thank you everyone for watching all our videos and liking and subscribing. Please continue to do so. I shall see you in the next one.